Welcome everyone. This is a video that's meant to help you out with the 1.5, right? So this is a section that has some intuition about limits, but also these things about vertical asymptotes, right? So and the claim is this is maybe a vertical asymptote problem, and this is a tough one. It's similar to something that you're probably encountering or going to encounter on the web work homework. So I wanted to make this video because it is a tough problem. Okay, so the big thing here is that we have this limit that we want to evaluate, and tangent is actually, right, it's made up of a sine and a cosine, right? So even though it doesn't look like it right here, you actually do have a denominator. So I want to go ahead and rewrite this thing, maybe as my first step here, as x sine of 2x divided by cosine of 2x, right? So, okay. And maybe as you saw with some of these piecewise defined functions, or if you went ahead and you watched the videos for 1.6, a first kind of good step is maybe going ahead and plugging in this value, this a value, this pi over 4, everywhere we see an x, and just see what happens, right? This kind of helps us determine what situation we're in. So if I go ahead and I plug in, right, as x goes to pi over 4, if I go ahead and plug in pi over 4 everywhere I see an x, well, I have pi over 4, and then sine of 2 times pi over 4, that's going to be pi over 2. And then cosine of 2 times pi over 4, that's going to be pi over 2. And okay, so sine of pi over 2, that's going to be 1. And cosine of pi over 2, that's going to be 0. And so from this, you can see that in the numerator, we have a nice positive value. That's the big thing here, is that in the numerator we have a nice positive value. And then in the denominator we're dividing by something that's very, very close to 0. But the question is this 0 just a little bit positive or a little bit negative, right? Because we're heading to this pi over 4 from the right. So the question is this 0 just a little bit negative, or is it a little bit positive? And right, if it's a little bit positive, then we'll have a positive divided by positive, but we know that this is a vertical asymptote, so the answer will be positive infinity. Or if this happens to be a negative, right, then we'll have positive divided by negative, so that'll be negative. And again, we know our answer will be negative infinity. So if this is confusing, I would recommend that you rewatch the video in 1.5 about these vertical asymptotes, because this is the strategy that we were talking about. Okay, so in order to figure out is this 0 here a little bit positive or a little bit negative, we would usually plug in something that's very close to pi over 4, but just a little bit to the right of it, right? Because this is approaching from the right. So if I went ahead and I drew out my number line, something that's close to pi over 4, but just a little bit to the right of it, because again, we're approaching from the right. Well, with these sines and with these cosines, right, there's only so many things that we can plug into these because they have to be on the unit circle, right? Sine and cosine are complicated functions. So to actually get close enough to this thing, close enough to pi over 4 that we actually get the right result, I'd like to bring up kind of another way that we can go about solving this problem right here, and that's by graphing these things. So I'm going to go ahead and graph the denominator. Again, this is cosine. I want to graph it, and I want to know as cosine of 2x heads towards pi over 4, is it positive or is it negative at that time? So again, let me go ahead and maybe draw up a little bit of a graph. This one's just going to be for cosine of x. I know cosine starts up here at 1, and then it comes down to 0, and that's at pi over 2. And then at pi over here, it's down at negative 1. So it looks something like this, and of course it continues on and on forever, right? It wiggles back and forth. I know that this is going to go like this, and it's going to go back up, and stuff like this. And it goes on forever. But I'm kind of only interested maybe in this interval here. So this is cosine of x. This is an easy one for us to graph. We've probably seen this several times. Now let's go ahead and try to graph cosine of 2x, because that's what we really need, cosine of 2x. Well, again, if you plug in 0 into this thing, you do get cosine of 0, which is 1. But you saw at pi over 4, if you plug that in, because you're multiplying by 2, well, pi over 4 times 2 is going to be pi over 2. So actually now it hits 0 already at pi over 4. And likewise, if you were to plug in maybe pi over 2, well, because you're doubling it, that's going to be the same thing as cosine of pi. And cosine of pi is -1. And so we actually get the same picture, but it's been shrunk, right? So if you remember something about graph transformations back from a long time ago in algebra and stuff, this ×2 right here is actually shrinking the graph horizontally by a factor of 2. So you can see kind of it's going twice as fast as it was before. Okay, now that we have the picture of the denominator, again, we drew this because it was the denominator here. That's why we drew this one. And we're interested as you approach pi over 4 from the right, something like this. And the question is, we know that we're getting closer and closer to 0, but is that 0, as we're approaching from the right, is it positive or negative? And the answer in this case is that it's negative, because we are below this x-axis, right? And so this 0 is going to be really close to 0, but it's going to be a little bit negative. So we have a positive divided by 0, essentially, but something that's very, very close to 0, but just a little bit negative. And therefore, this is heading towards -infinity. Now, of course, anytime I do a complicated problem like this, I think it's a good idea to go ahead and check our work. And so I went ahead and graphed for us x tangent of 2x on our Desmos calculator here, x tangent of 2x, and I'm interested here at pi over 4. Again, my hypothesis based on this work here is that if I approach from the right, I'm heading towards -infinity. Maybe let me go ahead and write this down. This will be our answer here. So this is heading towards -infinity because we have a positive divided by a negative, so that's the negative bit, and we knew that we were dividing by 0, so it's going to be some sort of vertical asymptote. So again, our hypothesis here is that we're heading towards -infinity. Let's go ahead and verify with our graph. So again, I've graphed our function, I've graphed the line at pi over 4, so we can kind of know which one to look at, because this is a complicated function, as you can see. And as I approach pi over 4 from the right, so I'm to the right of pi over 4, and as I approach this line, this pi over 4, you can see that indeed I do get smaller and smaller and smaller. It looks like I'm heading towards -infinity. All right, so, and I want to show you a second kind of similar related problem to this one. So this kind of is done with this one. The answer is -infinity. Let me go ahead and show you for this one here, when you have secant, same sort of setup. I did x secant of 2x. It's going to be the same strategy. We have the limit as x goes to pi over 4 from the right. And in this case, instead of secant, let me go ahead and write this as division by cosine. Division by cosine, right? Because secant is just 1 over cosine. And so now you can see that this is very similar to our previous problem. The only thing is that we're missing this sign right here, right? We have the x and we have the cosine. We have the x and we have the cosine. So this is going to happen very similar to what it was before. Again, if you go ahead and you try plugging in this pi over 4, you're going to get pi over 4 on top, which is a nice positive number. And then you're going to get 0 on bottom, right? Because this is going to be cosine of pi over 2, which is 0. And so again, the question is, we know the top thing is positive. Is that 0 on the bottom a little bit positive or a little bit negative? And so we would go through all of the same techniques. Notice that I went ahead and I drew this cosine of 2x. And then I see, as we approach pi over 4 from the right, it gets closer to 0, but is that 0 just a little bit positive or a little bit negative? And see, well, if you're close to it, but just to the right, well, you're a little bit negative. Right? So again, this 0 is going to be a little bit negative. And so a positive divided by a negative, this is going to have us head towards -infinity. And so we'll have actually the same result as we did before. But you can see kind of both of these, they're friends, right? They're related to each other. If you can solve one, then the claim is you can solve the other. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. Good luck on your homework. I'll see you guys probably Wednesday, right? See you then.